and welcome to Women to Women. I'm your hostess, Carol Paz, with a brand new, very special guest this evening, and we're going to get right to Henri Stone in just a moment. But first, I would like to thank our sponsors, Carpa Nevada LLC, importer of fine Portuguese olive oils, balsamic vinegar, and international teas, as well as Villa Basque, Deli and Cafe, home of Pete's famous Basque chorizo. So let's turn to Henri, welcome her, and Henri, myself included. I'd like to welcome, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here and an honor to meet with you.
We treasure the women who come on here as guests because they have always been gracious and willing to share what have turned out to be highly different lives for the most part, and yet sometimes they're involved behind the scenes, sometimes they're out in the front lines, but here in Northern Nevada, they're making a difference. So I know that this is going to be, perhaps with our viewers, you're going to hear viewers some very controversial stands that both Henri and I have taken because of our lives and because of women. We are working diligently, as every single guest, in some way or other, to make the lives of women better, safer, more productive, and economically, hopefully, independent if they have to be. So, Henri, tell us where you come from. Where do you originate from? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts. I grew up in the Boston area.
All right. So you come from, historically, the tramping ground of the beginnings of this republic.
Yes.
Very much so.
Very much so. In fact, I was just back there for my 50th high school reunion last week.
And I would imagine, now, I could be wrong, let me know, but if you come from Boston or New York, or you come from even way up in Maine, Vermont, there is that strong sense of identity because many immigrants came there and made their way to the shores of America through Ellis Island, and they brought strong cultural, traditional values with them. But they came to a new country, and we're grateful to be able to come here. So I would imagine that there are some pretty strong opinions, both politically and otherwise, on the East Coast and in Massachusetts for sure.
Well, in Massachusetts for sure. Yeah.
So when you were growing up, what did your family talk about? I mean, what did you as kids and friends talk about?
Well, it was very interesting. I went to Lexington High School, which was pretty academically rigorous. Mm-hmm. My friends, I considered myself incompetent because I didn't get all 800s on my board scores. I only had 700s on my board scores. And it was we were very much oriented towards getting a good education.
Yes.
Yes.
So
and
true.
Our parents didn't necessarily have very much money, although they had great educations. My maiden name is Tuck, and one of my ancestors founded the Tuck School at Dartmouth, Tuck School of Business. And those people actually met with Lincoln. Lincoln's son went to private school.
Yes, Robert.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so they had long discussions about forming the Republican Party. So I come from a very traditional family in Massachusetts, an old family in Massachusetts on my father's side, the Tuck side. And then my grandmother's side of the family came from Christiania, Norway.
Paternal or maternal?
Same, paternal side.
Okay.
So they were the Norwegian side and the Swedes. And so when they came to this country, they were very independent and hardworking. I remember my great-grandma.
To this day.
To this day, my great-grandma, if you touched the dish towel wrong, it went in the pot on the stove and was boiled and sterilized. So I remember that very well. She never spoke a word of English. Mm-hmm. And then my mom's side of the family was from the New Jersey, New York area. And they were involved with being a governor, one of them, and one was the head of a large Presbyterian church. So I came from a very political family.
And I think even to this day, you can go back to New York and you can sit in doctor's offices, dental offices, high school offices, wherever it is publicly, and one of the main concerns about Eastern peoples, East Coast peoples and families, is the education of their children.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a learning experience. I mean, it was for me to come from the Midwest, where I had a mother who was strongly pushing her girls to be highly educated and well-educated and academic. If we were academic, we were expected to be academic. So When did you move out of Massachusetts in that environment?
Well, it was interesting. I started at Tufts University. I started
Okay.
going to school at Tufts University, but then I transferred to the University of Colorado as a junior. So that's when I moved to the West and discovered that politics wasn't everyone's life. What a shock!
Okay, and that's a part of our growing up.
Yeah.
It's a part of our maturing, recognizing that in this huge country, we don't all think the same, and we don't all do the same. We don't live the same.
And one thing about Massachusetts politics, I was there in the height of the Kennedy scandals as well as
Yes.
everything else. But as part of my education, I was taught to think very rigorously, and you always said, well, there are two sides to every story.
For sure.
Yeah, and
for sure.
It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you want two sides to give you a rigorous debate with legitimate and responsible facts.
So where did you finally wind up with your education? Did you graduate from Colorado?
I graduated from the University of Colorado with a Bachelor of Science in dance and physical education. But I took time to take Arabic.
Okay.
And that was another little, as well as Spanish. And
All right.
then I went back to Smith College and got a master's degree at Smith.
And what
in
is your
Massachusetts.
master's in?
My master's is in physical education and dance.
Okay.
Education.
So you ultimately went back to the home stomping grounds. What brought you to Carson City, Nevada, or Genoa?
Genoa? Well, I'd been married and living in Colorado for 40 years. And my husband had a bad motorcycle accident, and he couldn't read. He couldn't write.
There was brain injury.
Yeah, and he hit a deer on his motorcycle, and he was unconscious, and 7 broken ribs, and lucky to be alive. And
Yes.
so up to that point, I'd been doing some real estate, and the real estate industry was collapsing. And so I went back to school at the ripe old age of 66, I think it was.
Good for you.
Yeah, and I got my endorsements in English as a second language because,
Okay.
I spoke a lot of languages by then. And I thought, living in the Vail area, we have lots of Latinos who work in our resort industry.
Yes.
And
As here in Nevada.
yeah, some of our schools are 85% Latino. I worked in an elementary school that was 85% Latino. And I have a great, I'm very simpático with the Latinos. I love the children, and
They're adorable.
And they work so hard. Our friends work 2 or 3 jobs, and our schools really inculcate our culture into these new kids. And I would ask my children in school, I taught kindergarten through 5th grade, I'd say, why did you come here? And I would hear outrageous stories. First of all, it was for a job to work here. Second of all, it was because my uncle got killed in the parking lot in Chihuahua by the drug people. I mean, they're afraid to go home. And so we have a wonderful group of Latinos in Eagle County, and I loved working there and teaching them. And so I was working, and my husband was healing, and he finally, unfortunately, got well. It's terrible to say, but when he got well,
all of that ability returned to him.
Well, yeah, it came back. And,
Wow.
And so he went first, he'd been in real estate, and so he went into the housing sector of public housing, because both of us are very service-oriented people. And he went first to Montgomery, Alabama, and worked there in their for the housing authority as their real estate director. And they had housing that was from the 40s that was falling down. And so his job was to plan and rebuild in Montgomery. And it was a really interesting change for us.
And not only just in geography or location, but also opening up your eyes to how a lot of other conditions exist in our own country that we hadn't even thought about or seen before.
Well, it was quite an interesting culture for me. I taught in Montgomery. I taught English as a second language, and my students were primarily Korean and Latinos, and the Koreans had come in with a big Hyundai plant. And so they were of a social strata that was very elevated. And my Latinos had come in as part of the working population. So I had these two groups of children and some
different economic levels.
Oh,
different
yeah, and then
educational
some
levels.
Arabs and Indians, and quite a melting pot thrown in. So it was challenging to work in that.
Definitely. What would you say that during that time that you spent teaching English as a second language, that you came to understand about other nationalities, other cultures? What kind of an impact did that make upon you personally? Certainly you said you had more simpatico. Okay, you learned to love the Spanish language, apparently.
I've always loved the Spanish language. But it's, what's interesting, these little children are coming to us in our schools, and they're at a very young age, an impressionable age, and they're coming out of diverse cultures. And our jobs as teachers of English as a second language is to help them learn the fundamentals of relationships in our society.
With our language.
With our language. And fundamentally, these children need to learn respect for each other coming from different cultures, which they'd always come in the door with, and then a respect for the teacher and respect for the structure of our schools.
And the staff.
This is tough at kindergarten level, coming in, and kids come in with different levels of education. Some of them have been to preschool. All the Koreans had private lessons in English because they're a real get-ahead, only one child society. And so they would come in with sometimes somewhat of an attitude that comes from being an only child. And then my Latino kids would come in, and sometimes their parents weren't working. They were coming from environments that weren't altogether wonderful. And so we needed to make school a place for them to be safe.
Okay, question coming up. And we're going to tackle this in more detail during the second half of the program. But this background, can you see it today as preparation for taking you out of the United States and into other cultures?
Well, I think
because you did wind up in another culture.
I wound up in Kuwait, but this was long before my English as a second language experience.
Okay, so what you're saying, Henri, is that prior to English as a second language, you did work with women, you did work with Kuwaiti families.
I worked with women from all across the Middle East, in Kuwait, from Kuwait, Jordan, the North Africa, that had come together for a big convention.
Okay, so briefly tell us in 30 seconds or less, your purpose, your goal in being in Kuwait was to do what?
Oh, my purpose and goal in being in Kuwait was to teach women how to run elections and how to run for office. I was there in September of 2005, right before the big Iraqi elections in January of 2006. So I had a group of probably 15 Iraqi women that I was working with to help them run those elections.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that because, as my viewers know, I've lived in the Middle East for many years and speak Farsi. You speak some Arabic, and our democratic, feminine ways are not their ways when it comes to politics, when it comes to being a part of that political system. And we're going to tackle that when we come back. Don't go away.
Are you looking for a healthier lifestyle? A more nutritious diet? Do you care about quality? If your answer is yes, or if you are just curious, come into Villa Basque Deli and Cafe right here in Carson City, Nevada. Discover fine Portuguese extra virgin olive oils, vintage balsamic vinegars, and a wide assortment of international health teas provided by distributor Carpa Nevada LLC. In addition to these terrific items, Villa Basque is also the home of Pete's famous Basque chorizo, handmade on the premises from Pete's secret family recipe. Satisfy your culinary curiosities. Don't delay.
How was school today?
Cool, we learned what to do in case there's an emergency.
Oh, will you show me? Yeah, and if there is an earthquake, then you get under your desk, duck, cover, and hold. And when the shaking stops,
we evacuate the school just like a fire drill.
I'm glad you both know what to do in case of an emergency, but I'd still be worried.
You're supposed to check the phone, radio, or TV, and they'll tell you what to do.
Make a plan.
Assemble a kit.
Stay informed.
And be ready.
When a disaster strikes our region, will you be ready? Learn about sheltering in place. Since each emergency is different, make sure you plan for alternate routes away from your neighborhood. Plan meeting places and long-distance phone numbers if you are separated. Assemble food, water, medicines for at least 3 days, and a portable radio to stay informed. Remember, make a plan, assemble a kit, stay informed, be ready. For more information, contact your local emergency manager.
Welcome back to the second half of Women to Women. We're talking with Henri Stone, who is from Northern Nevada, Genoa in specific. And Henri has had, for me, and I think for many of you listening out there and viewing, a most interesting background because she grew up on the East Coast with a heavy emphasis upon education, as East Coast families are really like that very much. And it kind of trails into the Midwest, and sometimes when we move around the country, we begin to discover not only how little we know about our own country and about the cultures and traditions that make up that region of America, but Henri finds herself eventually, after several years of marriage and living in this country, a representative of our country to the Middle Eastern nation of Kuwait. And this would have been, Henri, fill us in, prior to the Iraqi overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
No, this was actually after
the overthrow.
The overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Okay.
And prior to the elections of January 2006.
All right. And we know that you went there for the purpose of helping Kuwaiti women. No, Iraqi women.
Actually, it was Iraqi women, but women. The reason the convention was held in Kuwait City was because Iraq was going to have those elections, and they were close by. But we actually dealt with women from all across the Middle East and North Africa.
All right. So a very Islamic population in terms of culture.
Yes. And we did have some Christian, but mostly Muslim women.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when you arrived in Iraq and or Kuwait, you saw conditions quite differently from what your own life is like back here. Help us understand what some of those observations were.
Well, it was, what was interesting is when I was sitting in the airport, I was flying in on, I think it was, I don't know if it's Kuwaiti Airlines that I was flying in on, but I was sitting in a room and all of the other women in the room were wearing an abaya with a full hijab.
Okay, and that's the veil.
That's the veil.
And we call it in Iran, we call that the chador.
Yeah, and so I was sitting knee to knee practically opposite a woman who was just glaring at me. And she had a hot-looking husband beside her because the women are covered up. But he had his gold chain and his hairy little chest, and he was, trotting the trot. And the men looked like this, a lot of money. But the women are all covered up. And I thought, she doesn't look very nice, and she certainly is staring at me. And I had dressed very conservatively. I knew where I was going. I had a headscarf, and long sleeves and a long skirt. Then I started to look at her from top to bottom, and her abaya was a bit open, and I was really looking at what she had on underneath. And I discovered it was a pair of overalls, denim overalls, and she had Nike shoes on.
Okay.
And I thought, she's been to Walmart shopping, So I wasn't afraid anymore.
Okay.
And I thought, well, hey, this lady is just like me, only she has to dress in a full abaya.
Right, for modesty.
Right. And so then I got on the plane with everyone else in their abayas, and some of the ladies weren't wearing a full face veil. And I was sitting next to one, and I visited with her all the way in from London to Kuwait City and got my vocabulary up to snuff and had a delightful ride. So by the time I was on the ground, I was feeling better. Well, I was feeling better only briefly because my Arabic is limited and no one was speaking English, and I had to get from the airport to my hotel. And somehow I managed.
There are lots of sign language.
Lots of my Ali Amin, Ali Yasar, oh yes, and remembering my college Arabic. And I got to my hotel, and we were staying at the Marriott. It was a big convention of women there. There were, I think, 100 women from all across the Middle East.
Okay.
And fairly well guarded. They'd had 26 terrorists come over the border the day before, over the Iraqi border. And they had come in to, ostensibly, there's not much else going on in Kuwait City but our convention. And so it was possible that they were looking to interrupt or bomb our convention.
Okay, question, interjection here. Why was it that you decided to take on a task or responsibility like this? What is it about you and global politics, women in general? Why were you there personally?
When I was in high school, senior year paper was a paper on the Quran. Did a lot of research on Islamic cultures, and that kind of stuck with me. While I was busy doing physical education and dance, I was also doing Lebanese dancing and running a Lebanese dance group at the University of Colorado, which entailed me speaking more Arabic because you need to be able to talk to people who are dancing. And I had just kept this interest. And so there's a book out, Mayada, Daughter of Iraq, by Jean Sasson, and another one, Brighter Than the Baghdad Sun. And, I'd heard about all these torture prisons. And in Iraq, it was the
It's quite real.
Evin torture prison. In Tehran, it's the Evin, E-V-I-N torture prison. Evin. So I read Mayada, Daughter of Iraq, and it upset me so that I called a friend of mine that I knew worked with the State Department, and I said, Christine, if you ever need somebody to take one of your jobs and go and teach about politics, I had quite a political background, and I've been the chairman of the 2nd Congressional District, and this Colorado Federation, Republican Women, the 3rd vice chair, and I'd done a lot of political strategizing and coaching. She said, well, sure.
In fact.
Yeah, and she had come back from Indonesia, and like a week later, she said, could you send me your resume? And we need to get it off to the International Republican Institute. They need to send somebody into Kuwait to work with the Democrats. They were having a convention.
So I have, because of time, I have to kind of bring us around. So you took a personal interest because of actually some Arabic that you took back in your high school days, and also because of some Lebanese dancing, and kind of all plays together.
Oh, and then I read this book. And it was graphic about the torture prisons.
And I think for Americans, when they saw the film Not Without My Daughter, Sally Fields, who played the lead in that, based upon the book, Not Without My Daughter. And you have brought a book this evening, The Sewing Circles of Herat, which is another well-documented novel that tells about what life for women primarily is like. Even if you come from a very wealthy family, or you come from there is really no middle class. They think they have one growing, but actually it's not what we recognize as a middle. No. And then you have the level where education and not enough food, not enough proper necessities are not available to you. So you took a book can do that to you.
Oh,
it can change your life around.
Totally.
And it did yours.
And I prayed very hard, how can I help these women? I'm a fairly spiritual person, and I said, I really want to help these women. God, show me a way. In a week, I'd got my tickets to Kuwait.
God heard your call.
And
so, again, in the interest of time, I would love to go on and on and on. Help us understand one or two major impacts that really hit you when you were there, and what did you bring away from that experience? Would you go back again?
Oh, I'd go back in a heartbeat.
Okay.
And one of the major impacts, which I actually spoke to more than 2,000 people in a lot of talks, and was that these women are just like us, They want education for their children, they want their children to be safe, and they want their children to be free. And they're very well educated. These women in these Middle Eastern countries, many of them have been to school in New York, in Tokyo, in London,
Paris, all over.
And there's a lot of women and they're very old cultures. And these women want our help and need our help, and they are scared to death of the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban influence, because when Al-Qaeda and Taliban take over their countries, they kill these women. They torture them to death. They put them in prison just for wanting to be free and to be part of the system.
They are, as far as the Taliban and some of the other organizations that work against the rights of women, they are, they don't want any stranglehold on their authority, on the Taliban's authority or upon the direction that they're headed. And women tend to be well networked. They tend to be willing to help each other from country to country on a global scale, and that's a threat. That's a threat to those who want control of that
Well, I
country.
met amazing women who, to go out on the street meant risking their lives.
Yes,
To
very
go
much so.
and to run a campaign or to run for office. Their children were kidnapped. They had acid thrown at them. They had their legs blown off. These are women I met. And to think that these women would risk their lives for the freedoms that many of us take for granted.
Most of us take for
do.
granted, yes. If we're not a recent immigrant to this country, and if we have not asked for political asylum, we almost know nothing of what it means to live under that kind of terroristic regime. Our daily lives go on pretty much on a normal basis. We're free to come and go. We're free to buy. We're free to speak. And that's something that is just not available to a large portion of the world. And you've witnessed it. You've seen it.
Oh,
You've been a part of it.
firsthand. And I've spoken about this because when the United States foreign policy is not strong, these women are terrified. And these are Bronze Age thugs coming after these women.
Why do you
That's
say
what they are.
Why do you say bronze-aged thugs?
Because Al-Qaeda and Taliban are not educated for the most part, other than in the Quranic scriptures. And they run schools, madrasas, where the boys repeat and repeat the Quranic scriptures. That's all they learn.
And you might also be implying there that because these were vast empires, pieces of geographic landscapes, that in the case of Iran, old Persia was 2,500 years old it lasted. So, and they still celebrate those cultures. There's still a specific way to do things. And if you deviate from those ways, if you try and add or be creative, there's a lot of criticism that comes in. Any change is a threat.
And there are these sewing circles of Herat. It's a very interesting part of Afghanistan because these are, the women there traditionally never wore a headscarf. They were always treated with respect. They were always educated. And then the Taliban came in. And they had to stay in their rooms. It's as though you and I, suddenly the secret police, the religious police came, and we couldn't go out of our houses.
Well, I'm hoping that this discussion that we're having is opening up hearts and minds and ears as to possibilities. They know that I am 69. You are 67.
67. I'll be 68 next month.
Okay. And what you are doing, Henri, with your life, you're bringing back into this country an awareness that we can make differences in other countries. We can make differences in other families who live outside of this country.
These are our sisters.
Yes, they are.
They are our women. They are our sisters. And I'm 67. I've been bucked off a horse twice this summer. I've broken 8 ribs, and I'm fine. So I think that perhaps...
Yes, and I always like to think of our lives as the best is yet to come, because we need a certain maturity, we need a certain recognition with our eyes and our ears and our thoughts that not everybody lives the same way, and it's great, it's wonderful to be able to say, I'm willing to take a chance, I'm willing to step out there, and you've done it, and you're a living example of that. So I thank you so much for being with us
Well,
today.
thank you for having me. It's a passion of mine because I do believe in the sisterhood of women.
I do too. I do too, and that's the core of this program. So we just encourage you to write us on our email address that will be up there on the screen. Like us on Facebook. Anytime you have comments or questions, don't hesitate, and you'll get a personal reply back from Carol Paz. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening out there. Take care.